Hi everyone.
When I was younger, I was fascinated with the world of medieval music. It was this thing that was so foreign to me. Of course, you see it in media all the time, but most of the time, well, it's like made up. So that made me wonder, what was it really like back then? What was music like for someone who lived 1,000 years ago?
Eventually, I was able to find music that was written down then, which left me feeling somewhat satisfied. But one thing I was always confused about was the notation that they used. Like, how do we even know that this is what they actually did? In different videos, I would see the actual manuscripts from which the music was written, and they were practically impossible for me to make sense of. I would try and compare them to the remade score in the video that's similar to our modern notation.
But I still couldn't really understand it. The notational system that was used up until around the start of the Baroque era has many differences to our modern notation. And while some things can transfer over, many other things cannot. That is why I'm making this video now. And while medieval music doesn't fascinate me nearly as much as it did when I was younger, I am finally going to understand how you would actually read those manuscripts. As a side note, you might be wondering about the music that people would have actually been listening to during this time, because, like, people weren't listening to this music that we had written down, it was for monks. And the short answer is that we don't really know what secular music was like back then. It wasn't written down for a while, and if people didn't write it down, we don't really know what it sounded like.
The music I came across when I was younger came from what was known as the Notre Dame School of Polyphony, and specifically two composers named Leonidas and Perotinus. Or Leonin and Perotin. I've found conflicting results on what their names actually were.
Following the fall of the Roman Empire, the main two groups it was split into were the Western Roman Church and the Eastern Byzantine Church. There were some other groups, such as the Egyptian Coptic Church, but these were the main two for the Western world. Now, it was in the Western Roman Church that we saw the major developments of music as it relates to the Western world. Early on, music was seen as a reflection of character, and as such was banned from everyday usage. It was thought that by listening to bad music, it would make you a bad person, and you would go and do bad things. This line of thinking actually can be traced back to the ancient Greeks. Music was mainly used by monks for daily reading of psalms. The idea was that these words were just too holy to be said normally, so we had to sing them, really bring out the Lord in them. An issue arose, however, in that the music wasn't really standardized across the whole empire, and different regions had different ideas on how it should have been sung.
Frankly, it was all out of whack, and in 754 CE, we start to find the first example of neumes. They were invented during a visit of Charlemagne's father Pepin to Pope Stephen II. In this system, dots and lines were placed above the music to try and indicate the pitch. This is an example of neumes, and they work by giving you a general idea of where the pitch is going, starting from the dot that you have.
This system was definitely an improvement, but it was far from being as ideal as our modern system. It still required that someone teach you how to sing the chant before you could sing it.
Starting in around the 10th century, one of the first improvements was the addition of a line to give you a reference as to where the pitches were. This came about after people increased the amount of space given to notation relative to the text, and would draw longer lines and dots for the music.
Over time, more lines were added to the music, which gave an even better reference as to where the pitches were. This is one of the most prominent features of music notation that remains to this day. But who exactly developed the music staff is a mystery among scholars. Guido of Arezzo is typically credited, but it is unknown how much he actually contributed to the staff. The system of neumes that developed over time proved to be very effective for Gregorian chant itself. But later down the line, the system would present issues that had to be resolved in order to make polyphonic music.
From around the 13th century to the 15th century, there were two distinct eras, at least in France, the Ars Antiqua and the Ars Nova. As can be likely inferred from the name, the Ars Nova came after the Ars Antiqua, but this was the first time that polyphonic music appeared that happened to be written down. It is within these two eras do two systems of notation show up, that being modal notation and mensural notation. Mensural notation mainly appears at the start of the Ars Nova, and lasts all the way until the end of the Renaissance.
This notation was directly built on modal notation, and could be considered a direct improvement to that system. Mensural notation mainly greatly improved the rhythmic possibilities within music and made it so that more complex music could be made. Improvements in the notation are a big part in what allowed music to advance and get into a more refined era of polyphonic development.
In order to understand modal notation, however, it is important to clarify that notation up until the Baroque era functioned very differently to how it does today. At least it did in the rhythmic department. Reading pitches has remained relatively consistent throughout the years, with the idea of C clefs even appearing in modal notation some 800 years ago. With that being said, starting in the 13th century, the first two types of duration appear for music, that being the longa and the brevis. This system was very simple. The longa is twice the length of a brevis. Now you might be confused when you look at the notation, because there's only squares. But that's because the longa and the brevis didn't really have different signs. They were more conceptual ideas than actual notes. All you could get was square. And I will go into how you could tell a difference in a little bit. But these names actually still hold up today in the European standard for naming notes, as it is the name for the longest note that is commonly used, being the semibreve, or what is referred to as a whole note in the American system.
This is why some modern transcriptions of medieval music use massive note values for notes that aren't even held very long. Those were just the notes that were invented first. Also, today we tend to default to thinking of music in groupings of 2, especially given how prevalent 4/4 is. But in the medieval era, it was groupings of 3 that were the default. And not only were they the default, they were the only way. The book Mensurabilia Musica, written by Johannes de Garlandia in circa 1250, outlined the different ways that you could combine a longa and a brevis, because yes, you were limited.
Each group of notes could only be combined in 6 ways. There is trochaic, iambic, dactylic, anapaestic, melosic, and tribraic. It is worth noting, however, that these words come from poetry, and are not the words that medieval musicians were using. Scholars would later use these words to describe what they were doing. I'm only bringing them up here to provide a comparison that might help explain how it works. Now, if you look at medieval music, you won't see squares by themselves like notes are today. You just see a bunch of weird lines and square-like objects. Instead, and what I didn't know about when I was younger, is that these notes are displayed in what are known as ligatures.
A ligature is a general word that refers to two things being combined. In language, it refers to the merging of letters to form new ones. So like the symbol where they have an A and an E combined, I forget what it's called, that's a ligature. In music, however, medieval musicians would combine notes in a similar way, and you read it on somewhat established rules. This system ended up becoming extremely complex over time, and in the Renaissance, frankly, reached absurd levels of stupidity. But that's not for much later. Suffice to say, this system is not in use for our modern notation. And it's worth noting that scores in the medieval era were thought more of like art pieces compared to today, where a score might only serve a practical purpose, despite how beautiful an engraver might make it look.
Okay, so what did the ligatures actually mean, though? Well, they're pretty straightforward to understand, actually. Each ligature was somewhat standardized, and you could tell what they meant once you learned what they were. For example, this ligature, the clevis, is just 2 descending notes. Now, if you try and read the music that monks wrote down, you will quickly realize that the two note values I mentioned earlier, the longa and the brevis, not even come close to accounting for the rhythmic possibilities that you find in this music. That is where the main difference of notation before the Baroque era comes into play, and what makes it so confusing to read, which is the fact that note lengths were context dependent.
In our modern notation, this doesn't exist. If you see a whole note, it is always double the length of a half note, with the number of beats being dependent on the time signature. But looking at medieval notation, you will see that there are no distinct symbols for the note that could tell you for how long to play it. No half notes, no quarter notes, everything is just a black square, in France at least. Instead, there were those 6 ways to combine rhythms, and they form what we call rhythmic modes.
Essentially, each ligature corresponds to a specific amount of notes, and the pattern of ligatures that you see tells you the rhythm that is used for each note. So if you saw a 3-note ligature followed by 2 2-note ligatures, it means that you are in mode 1.
Modes 1 through 6 are what scholars use versus the poetic forms I mentioned earlier. If you are reading the music, you would have to see the mode ahead of time and retroactively apply that rhythm to the notes you saw before. There were even 4 and 5-note ligatures that could be found across all of the notation from this era. But as you can guess, those present issues in how to interpret the rhythmic mode. Once the rhythmic mode is established, the music might stay in that mode for a bit until it changes. How do you know when it changes? Context? Obviously?
For example, the pes represents 2 notes, while something like the perectus represents 3 notes. So a perectus followed by 2 pes would be in mode 1, and you would sing every note contained in the ligature as long, short. Now, when looking at a medieval score, you can see these different ligatures encased between what look like bar lines. They aren't bar lines, but there's a similar idea at play. They separate musical phrases, rather than being dependent on the amount of beats per group. These lines are known as divisio modi, and they split the grouping of ligatures into groups known as ordo. These bar lines are usually interpreted as a rest.
To give an example of how to read the notation, I'm going to try and show you how to read it by looking at the score I've been showing this entire video. The name of the piece is Viderunt omnes, and it was written by a prominent composer of the Notre Dame school named Perotin. I mentioned him earlier. He was one of the first composers to go beyond 2 lines of music, and greatly expanded the range of polyphonic music that we have today.
This piece was written down in a big book called the Magnus liber organi, which is the largest collection of polyphonic music we have from this era. Alright, so this is the Magnus liber organi right here. You can get it off IMSLP pretty easily. And the first piece in the book actually is Viderunt omnes, which was really convenient because I didn't have to sort through that to find it. Now you can see that there's 4 lines here, 1 for each singer, as this was a 4-voice polyphonic piece, but I'm only going to be transcribing the first top line here, as that is the... As you could apply the same logic as this top line to the other ones. So you can see that there's a black bar here for each voice, and this likely would have been a note that you hold out, just a long one. It doesn't really fall into any of our modes, so we're just going to have to make an interpretation because it's surrounded by an ordo, so it's part of a phrase. All right, so getting into the first proper ordo here, or actually I should write this down. So we're just going to have a big old C for our first measure. And the reason I know it's a C is because it's in this middle line here, which goes straight through the middle of this ancient C clef. It's still read in the same way that you would read it today. So this right here, So in order to figure out the note values that I'm going to use, I'm going to try and assess the mode that this next ordo is in. Now, it kind of breaks the rules we have established, and I'll get into that in a bit. But for these first 2 ligatures here, I can see that this first one is a 3, the Perotinus, and the second one is 2, the Pes. So it's not exactly 3-2-2, but it is 3-2. So that means I can comfortably put it into mode 1. And mode 1 was the most common one at the time, so it's fair to make the assumption that that's what it was. So remember, that was long, short, long. Now I can see that this corner here goes on this third line from the C line, so I can transcribe that as an E. So long, and then it goes down to this space right here, which would have been a D, short, and then it goes up to the line again, so that would have been an E. And then we arrive at this pass right here, and we're just going to keep doing that in the same way. So this first note is going to be an eighth note on an F, because it's one line above this. And as you can see, we have a very nice long, short going right here. But then, as we can see, this doesn't really line up, because this isn't a two-note ligature. This is just one note. And this is a case of one of the exceptions that we have had to make. So if you look at the end of this ordo right here, you can see that we run into an issue, as this doesn't add up to any of the patterns that we really have. And this is an example of one of the many issues that makes this system way more complex than I let on. Because there's no way it could possibly be that easy. This is an example of the extensio modi, and it refers to the omission of a brevis from the transcription. It is not to be confused with the fractio modi, which looks the exact same, but means something completely different. In the case of this transcription, it would actually be transcribed like this. Well, I'm not really going to get into the weeds of how you would interpret these.
As you can see, this can pose many challenges to decipher, and it's why there are people who dedicate their whole life to it. This is not even mentioning how other regions would have different styles, or how it changed as it went on. And even among the scholars that understand this stuff, they frequently disagree about this stuff.
You might be wondering how we even know how to read this at all, but the reason is quite simple, actually. People wrote treatises about how to read it. One example I mentioned earlier was De Mensurabili Musica, written by Johannes de Garlandia. It is worth pointing out, however, that this was written after Viderunt omnes was composed, but it still outlines the musical practices that were used at that time when it was written.
Alas, achieving fluency in reading this and knowing every little exception that might take place would take years of study and practice, along with having intimate knowledge of how the music of the time was performed. And you are doing all of that to learn a style of music that is so limiting that syncopation is actually impossible. Anyway, one day someone came along and decided to make this better, and it's what led us to mensural notation.
Now, I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds on mensural notation, as there are many other videos out there that go into the topic at length, but it is a direct evolution of the modal notation that came beforehand. The main advantage of mensural notation is that people invented the number 2.
In all seriousness, this is where the advent of using different symbols to represent note lengths came about. And our notes today can be traced back to these. Starting to appear at the end of the 13th century, this improved notation greatly increased the complexity of the polyphonic music at the time.
This can be heard in the music of people like Guillaume De Machaut, whose polyphonic music can really stretch the ear at times. This is one of his most famous works, the Messe de Notre Dame. Listen to that. Long longer are we bound to the shackles of Mode 1, living out our lives cursed with long, short. So, does that mean that mensural notation works like modern notation?
No, not really, because mensural notation is still context-dependent, like modal notation. However, it makes somewhat more sense to read this music And we know that people actually read it, as amateur music making was a big deal among aristocrats in the Renaissance, and they had to get their music from somewhere. I mention this because, let's think about this for a second. Were people actually reading music written down by the Notre Dame School of Polyphony? What I mean is, was the notation actually just intended as a way to preserve the music instead of being used for any real performance like you would sight read a piece today? We know the music was performed, as Viderunt omnes was performed in 1198 at the Feast of the Circumcision. But all the musicians were likely just taught this by ear, maybe even never having seen the notation itself.
But how did we even get to mensuration? First, we saw the introduction of two new notes, that being the maxima, the new longest note, and the semibrevis, the new shortest note. However, with the introduction of music that could be in two, a new problem arises. How do we distinguish between them? In modern times, we use the time signature, but this wouldn't be seen for a bit, and when it did appear, it still functioned differently than it does today. Now, in mensural notation, music existed in two ways, either perfect or imperfect. Perfect music was in three, like the Holy Trinity, and imperfect music was in two. Whether or not something was perfect or not was dictated by context, as in the notes around one note would still determine how long it was. It was just a little bit easier now. For example, a longa is always perfect if it is followed by another longa, so it's 3 beats. But if it's followed by a brevis, the first longa is imperfect. Now it is 2 beats.
So, ultimately, was I able to get the answer on how to read medieval music? Well, no, not really. I mean, kinda, I guess. But, I know more than I used to, and the basics make enough sense to me that I can read it a little bit. I feel like younger me would have been satisfied. If you want to know more information on early music notation, the book The Notation of Polyphonic Music 900 to 1600 by Willie Apel is basically the ultimate guide to this stuff and was a massive help for this video. It goes into way more detail than I went into here and covers a way broader amount of time and regions.